Well, I clap you for coming out on a very cold night. Well, this is the latest book that I've written, and it's actually the third memoir. I did one on the 1960s called Promise of a Dream, and then I did one on the 70s called Daring to Hope, and then Reasons to Rebel in the 1980s. I haven't any intentions of doing any more, so this is probably the third one, and probably the last one. I'm very glad to be able to talk about it. This is the first talk I've done on it, actually. I was writing it for about 2 or 3 years before it actually came out, and I found that it's quite strange going back to talk about it, because I feel that somehow that I've written it and that's it, off it goes. But I did go back, and I try and give you an idea of what it's about. It covers the period from 1980 to 1989, and it follows on from Daring to Hope, which was on the 1970s. So it's goes on from the period that I was totally immersed in women's liberation through the 70s. And in the 1980s, things got a bit less clear, and there were sort of different kinds of movements developing. And I also got involved, slightly to my surprise, with working at the Greater London Council in this period. So I cover that in the book. But we found that we had a situation of a bit of exhaustion, I think, by 1980 in relation to the women's movement, because we'd been campaigning from the late 1960s, and there was a feeling that a new generation were coming along, and we older ones who'd been there for the previous decade were kind of stepping back, and the new ones were coming along. So it was rather different. And also I think the peace movement was so important in the 1980s to people, and that meant that there was a combination of different people from different kinds of aspects of the left getting involved in that. But I was still affected by the confidence and enthusiasm that the women's liberation movement had generated in 1980. And there's still the friendships and the sisterhood and interaction between women who'd been involved together for the previous 10 years in the women's movement. I did feel, though, that there was a series of dilemmas that had come up from the politics of the 1970s. And I was really grappling with those dilemmas. One really was how to participate in movements that were specifically for the liberation of women without wrapping ourselves in a defensive assertion of difference, which was a thing which Simone de Beauvoir had raised about, how you asserted what a particular state that you were without cutting yourself off from other kinds of forms of understanding and connection. And really how to distinguish between the needs that were provided by the state and the authoritarian control that often came with that type of welfare. There were things that seemed to be something that you would support, and yet, on the other hand, there were snags in the way it was coming to people, and there was this difficulty of being critical and yet also recognising that these things were needed. So in those kinds of dilemmas, there was then the impact of Margaret Thatcher. And really, I think when Margaret Thatcher first arose, I don't think we could comprehend what we were up against, because we hadn't had such a overtly right-wing opponent. And the fact that somebody was saying such what seemed like outrageous things, and then what was even more alarming, that quite a lot of people seemed to agree with this person, was quite a shock. And I think it took, certainly my generation, a while to realise that this was something that was going to last. I think initially I thought people will get fed up. And of course they didn't. And then in the 1980s, we had a new form of right-wing conservatism to contend with. So though the memories that I have of the 1980s do include a certain amount of frustration and sadness and personal and political, along with the discouraging defeats that occurred, there were also aspects of this. I was in my late 30s and early 40s. Also a lot of excitement and fun and chances of exploring broader horizons, geographically and intellectually. And I was really strengthened by the many close friendships that occurred partly through women's liberation and partly through left politics. The humour and the shared sense of purpose, and those have gone on into later life. As I wrote and edited and re-edited the manuscript on the 80s, I realised that I had three sort of different chunks of time. One was in the early 80s, when I was still preoccupied with many of the concerns of the late 70s, which, having written Beyond the Fragments, Feminism and the Making of Socialism with Lynn Siegel and Hilary Wainwright, it seemed to be that important to try and draw on the insights from the women's liberation movement and to broaden them out, to foster a socialism that was inspired by new forces and groups which had come into being from the late 1960s. But when we held a large Beyond the Fragments conference, I can't remember exactly how many people came. Lynn might remember, who's sitting at the back. But there was about 2,000 people, I think. There's about 2,000 people came. And that was we didn't know all these people before the conference arose. You know, they weren't sort of known members or anything. They just sort of erupted as a result of the book which Hilary Wainwright, Lynn Siegel and I did, because I think we just struck a chord talking about how our experience in women's liberation was something that we thought was of political interest to other people on the left as well. The people who came to the conference was an extraordinary mixture of trade unionists, community, left cultural activists, and it was a very exciting event, but it was very difficult to know quite how to follow it up. Afterwards, groups did meet, but then they sort of got lost, you know, because after a time of meeting together and talking, it was difficult to know what next. We didn't really know what to do. But I think that what happened was that and people in the room may even remember some, things developed out of those discussions, none of which were ever sort of centrally known by anybody. In retrospect, the incredulity with which people like me regarded Margaret Thatcher probably seems very naive. But because we hadn't experienced an opponent who was so overtly and explicitly right-wing before, it was difficult to know how to respond. I think we didn't know what we were dealing with because we were used to a much more smoothly covered up kind of conservatism. One of the things that occurred in that time was that the buffers which had been put up by various generations through developing welfare state began to be dismantled, and that was really something that was very difficult to realise, because I think we, as a welfare state child, people like me had just grown up accepting that those kind of welfare things were integral to modern capitalism. They weren't anything that we necessarily thought was absolutely the bee's knees. We wanted much more extensive changes. But what we discovered was that things that we'd taken for granted in state welfare started to really be cut and diminished. And that a different kind of capitalism had decided it didn't need those things which had become part of the 1950s welfare deal. So we were so busy criticising the inadequacies of it that I think we had to spend a bit of time to turn around to realise that quite a lot of things were just disappearing. I found a job at the GLC in 1983. I got employed in the Popular Planning Unit, which was part of the Economic Policy Group. And that was quite extraordinary. I'd never worked in a large institution before. I taught, in schools and further education colleges, but I hadn't worked in local government. And it was a very steep learning curve and extremely interesting and rewarding, because it was actually possible, because the GLC, which older people will remember, had an income which was quite considerable, because people in London all paid their rates. So the GLC could actually run all sorts of sort of counter welfare provision, and as things were being demolished by the central government in London, it was possible for a time in the 1980s to complement a lot of the provision that was disappearing. So I went to work there, as I said, in 1983 with a group of innovative left-wing councillors who were quite different from the mainstream Labour people in many ways, but also with a group of people who were with the Economic Policy Unit, and the bit that I was connected to, it grew. I think there were 5 people originally. This is sort of massive left bureaucracy appeared. 5 people were doing economic planning for the whole of London. They discovered that this was rather a large task to create this alternative strategy for the whole of London. And it grew. I think by the end there was about 200 people employed trying to counter a government's economic policy. And the things that I did was that I worked with groups of people who were participating through, having meetings about their things. There may be people here who went to some of those kinds of meetings, because the GLC was constantly having meetings to get people to participate. But it was a very exciting experience, because there was this massive county hall, this sort of enormous bureaucracy, and it was being sort of turned around like a great big liner to do all sorts of things that it hadn't done before, and also to go out to people and to say to people, well, we actually do want you to put your ideas forward and contribute from your own knowledge what kinds of changes should be made. So for several years there was this rather radical machine that had strangely quite a lot of money, because everybody was paying their rates, and it was possible to do that, to redistribute those in ways that hadn't been done by the older, more conservative forms of local government at County Hall. And there was a lot of interest in new kinds of measures. So the GLC started to campaign on issues which now would seem absolutely normal, about food. But it was seen as totally cranky to raise the issue of food that was really unhealthy being served, in school dinners and things like that. And this was seen as, sort of wacky and cranky. And those ideas have become, so obvious, I think, they would be sort of commonsensical to a lot of people now. They were taken up by the right-wing tabloids, and there was a great fuss going on because Ken Livingstone had criticised the British sausage as a very unhealthy thing, and talked about how sausages could be improved. So there was this sort of thing that these tabloids all took in about the Red Ken sausage, and so the GLC was seen as the people who were campaigning for Red Ken sausages. I don't think Red Ken ever had actually an alternative sausage menu, but he did know from the people who were advising him that the existing sausages were not very good. But those things are just sort of normal things now. We're seen as really wacky and weird. The things that the GLC already did, like having the Philharmonic Orchestra, were then sort of redeployed. So the Philharmonic Orchestra was sent round factories. I don't know quite what people made of it. It played in factory canteens, and it played to pensioners who were doing bebopping in the parks, and things like the Hackney Empire, which was an old music hall, could be reclaimed from bingo, where it had ended up, by members of the left-wing comedy group, the cartoon archetypal slogan theatre, or cast, that some people remember. I only had a half-time job because I had a small son at that time in the popular planning unit of the Economic Policy Group, which was under the auspices of the Industry and Employment Committee. So there were all these kinds of different bits that are gradually grasped. But what I really found interesting, having never worked in a large institution like that, was there was this vast thing called County Hall, which was, the building is enormous, and it's like some sort of Gormenghast kind of castle, and you can sort of walk the corridors and you could see people doing different things, and mysterious people, and many people visited it because the GLC became internationally interesting. So you would sort of bump into a group of militant gondoliers from Venice who had been on strike and were coming to show solidarity with GLC. And they all got stuck in the doors one time when I was leaving the building. So there was a kind of constant stream of strange people. And then also more familiar would be the fire brigade, who would arrive with all their instruments because they used County Hall to practice for their band, which was the brass band of the fire brigade. And the fire brigade became a bit like this sort of alternative army, because they were all kind of very smart and had uniforms and marched along. And we're all kind of coming to this citadel of alternative lefty government. The member who had brought all this into being was called Michael Ward. And Michael is a really sort of, he's like a very sort of radical Fabian. He has ideas of how you can use something and then you could sort of turn it around and give it a different edge to it and open it up. And he did that with local government because he already had experience in local government, and he came in and understood how it worked, whereas people like me, and indeed Hilary Wainwright, who I was also working with, had never worked in local government. But because Michael had, understood its workings, he could understand how you can turn it around. I don't know if there's any seats. Actually, there are 2 seats for people who've just come at the back. I had this half-time job because I had my son was young, and I was in this popular planning unit, which was connected to the Economic Policy Group, which was connected to the Industry and Employment Committee, and the popular planning unit was seen as, I think the other people who were saw themselves more as a serious economist, used to think that we had it very kind of easy because they suspected that we looked far too happy when we came to work. And indeed that was actually because Hilary Wainwright was a very good boss, because Hilary had this sort of mixture of commitment and negligence because she was always doing something else. So she actually left you to get on with what you wanted to do, but when you hit any difficulties with the bureaucracy, she would sort of be there with you, and you could always rely on Hilary to sort of raise it and persistently follow it through. So she was a very good boss to have, actually. We were very highly motivated because we've never done anything like that before, and we were incredibly excited to be able to try to get more participation for a citywide economic strategy, which was serving social needs at work and in communities. And my job was to produce a newspaper with a guy called John Hoyland, who, it was a sort of two of us did this Jobs for a Change newspaper, which copies must exist in GLC archive, I think, which was informing people about the policies and the projects. But we also ended up doing quite a lot of other things because we would be involved in other types of activity as well. I was involved because of my experience in women's liberation with the Women's Committee as well as with Industry and Employment. The thing that Women's Committee was very committed to, and also Industry and Employment supported because of women's working needs, was childcare. There was women were being pulled into the labour force in London at that time, and there was absolutely hardly any provision, you're nodding, for childcare, and it was just an enormous problem. It was being met by childminders, and childminders were not very well organised or equipped, It was a very difficult position for women who had children and were working. And there had been community projects which developed to supplement the state nurseries. And one such thing was a place called Market Nursery in Hackney, of which I have very fond memories and great gratitude, because when my son Will was little, he went to Market Nursery, and you paid, I think it was about £6 a week, and the rest of the money came from a grant from Hackney Council, and I think also from the GLC there was a grant for market nurseries. So those kinds of community projects with funding were really stepping into the gap which the state provision, in no way met. And also they were much more participatory and democratic than the state provided projects. It was a really rich experience working at the GLC, to be able to see a process of possible transformation actually occurring, some of which remained after the GLC was abolished, but quite a lot did collapse, I think. On the other hand, and there may be people here who remember this, the local councils in London did often step in after the GLC was abolished by the Thatcher government. In the late 1980s, after the collapse of the GLC, I continued to follow up a lot of the things that I'd got interested in there. There was support for organisation, for example, of women who were working at home as home workers, doing sewing and work that was been sent out from firms. And lots of different types of groups were trying to organise at that time. In the late 1980s, I was still interested in all those things to do with women's work, but in a wider sense, there was a concept of livelihood, which was raised, I think, particularly in the miners' strike by Women Against Pick Closures. So there was this vision of what people needed, really, as well as work for wages, where people in unions had obviously organised in the past. The home workers, we also began to realise, we're not just local or even limited to Britain, but it was a whole international issue. And interestingly, at that time, there were groups in various different countries who were organising with home workers. I think there was groups in Latin America, and there was a particularly strong movement in India called the Self-Employed Women's Association, which managed to organise home workers and other workers who were isolated. And it was interesting because those are exactly the people that most trade unionists in Britain would have said, no, there's no point because you can't do it. And so the fact that there were examples in other countries of people doing it was very important to us. That global interest was something that was also much wider than issues to do with homework. And there was a consciousness that we were part not simply of a national economic predicament, but that we had a global interaction, because there was many kinds of work, including things like homework, which when you started to trace the links, they were the links that were going internationally. And I became very close to an economist called Swasti Mitter, who some of you may know the work of at that time. And Swasti came from India originally and had been studying economics, and she became very interested in the global networks of women's work, and including of homework. The work that seemed to be the most local was, you discovered that the system of links and networks, and there was an economic chain that went internationally. And Swasti, and along with other women, were getting interested in showing that change. So Swasti was an important influence on me, and so was a woman called Kumari Jayawardena, who some people may have heard of. She was she's a socialist feminist from Sri Lanka who's written on women's conditions and the history of women in Sri Lanka. I got involved after the GLC with a United Nations university, which Kumari Jayawardena's husband, Lal Jayawardena, was the director of. And it was had a very long title. It was called the World Institute for Development Economic Research, and it was known as WIDER for short, and it was based in Helsinki. So having experienced life as a bureaucrat, alternative bureaucrat at the GLC, I think, an alternative bureaucrat in United Nations. So I was never really exactly full-time. I was a sort of contract worker in WIDER. But I found that the work I'd been doing at the GLC locally could be transplanted into that global context. And I was responsible for organising a meeting in 1990 on new ways of organising around women's work in Helsinki with Swasti Mitta, which resulted in a book that we edited called Dignity and Daily Bread. I was kind of quite taken aback to go into a bookshop and discover Dignity and Daily Bread was actually put into the cooking section. I was thinking people would probably be a bit puzzled if they thought they were finding a few menus and recipes. They discovered stuff about global economy. Anyway, I think I'll stop there. But that was something that was very important to me in the 1980s, the experience. But I never really followed it through because after I stopped working with WIDER, I went back to doing the kinds of things I'd done before, like teaching and things like that. So I didn't carry on working in anything like a economics network. I mean, I always felt very funny being an economist because I always knew I was a historian, but I somehow got kind of co-opted into the company of political economists, so I got classified as an economics person. But it was daily life kind of economics, really. So I'll stop there.